Florida. Known for its beautiful beaches, many tourist destinations, and the legendary Florida man himself. One of the fastest growing parts of the state is the southwestern coast, an area that is generally defined as the land south of Tampa Bay and mostly north of the Everglades. It's one of the most densely populated parts of the state, and plenty call it home. However, that paradise soon turned into a nightmare in September of 2022. After years of avoiding near total destruction, the southwestern coast dealt with its fiercest foe yet. Hurricane Ian was a destructive tropical cyclone that laid waste to numerous communities in Cuba and Florida. It was the strongest tropical cyclone in the Atlantic Basin in 3 years, with maximum sustained winds of 160 miles per hour and a minimum central pressure of 937 millibars, weakening slightly before slamming into the Floridian coastline, slowly traversing over the state before recurving and hitting South Carolina. The toll on the people was immense, causing $113 billion in damages and killing 161, with 13 missing. It quickly became the costliest disaster in Florida state history and the second deadliest, only behind the 1935 Labor Day hurricane. But the story of Hurricane Ian goes further than the actual storm itself, with many areas in one of the most hurricane-prone parts of the country being inadequately prepared for such a storm, especially when preparing for it. Today, we will take a deep dive into Hurricane Ian, covering its origins, meteorological synopsis, preparations, impact, response, and associated controversies, and the status of the impacted communities today. Welcome to Nature's Fury. On September 14th, a robust tropical wave developed off the west coast of Africa, slowly moving across the Atlantic over the next 6 days with occasional bursts of disorganized convection, limited by strong vertical wind shear and Saharan dust. The system was first noted in a tropical weather outlook on September 19th, before reaching the Windward Islands on the 21st, where convective activity increased as it traversed across the southeastern Caribbean Sea. Hurricane Fiona's equatorial outflow channel, which was north of the wave, generated moderate to strong vertical wind shear, slowing organization. Despite the persistent shear, around 5 a.m. Atlantic Standard Time on September 23rd, infrared satellite imagery indicated that the system had enough organized deep convection and a well-defined low-level circulation to be designated as a tropical depression. As the day progressed, thunderstorm activity began to build over the center, and by nightfall, satellite estimations indicated tropical storm force winds in portions of the system. At 11 p.m., the system was designated as Tropical Storm Ian. Alarm bells began ringing, with models indicating that Ian was on track to become one of the most significant storms of the 2022 season. There was a decent degree of agreement regarding model runs for Ian's short-term development. Ian would move west-northwestward along the southern periphery of a building ridge. The storm would then begin to intensify as it approached the Cayman Islands, before making landfall somewhere in Cuba. Once the system moved over into the Gulf, however, both long and short-term uncertainty began to make itself apparent. Some models projected a landfall on the Panhandle, Big Bend, or the Floridian Peninsula. A big variable that was likely responsible for such uncertainty was how the European and American models interpreted the development and movement of a broad trough over the eastern United States, alongside just a general leftward bias. As Ian honed in on the coastline, models narrowed landfall projections to southwestern Florida as a major hurricane, landing from the Tampa Bay area to near Fort Myers, slowly moving across the state of Florida before curving north into the coastline of Georgia or South Carolina. Let's focus on Cuba and Florida for now. Cuba's primary threats were storm surge, flash flooding, and strong winds. In Florida, similar threats were present. Predicted storm surge values the day before Ian made landfall ranged from 4 to 7 feet from near the Tampa Bay area to Sarasota, 8 to 12 feet from Sarasota to Fort Myers, and 6 to 9 feet in areas around Marco Island. However, it's important to note that due to the massive variation in forecast models before that day, the surge estimates did vary, But keep in mind, Southwest Florida was still expected to get significant surge in most forecasts. Widespread rainfall totals ranging from 7 to 10 inches were expected in Central Florida, with localized totals up to 24 inches. Most major storms generally tend to receive preliminary comparisons to other notable storms. Ian was no stranger, as it sorely resembled Hurricane Charley of 2004, which followed roughly the same path Ian would soon take. On September 23rd, storm centers began issuing tropical storm and hurricane watches for islands in the Caribbean, and for portions of Florida beginning on the 25th. Additional watches and warnings for storm surge and flooding followed as the storm approached land. The Weather Prediction Center issued a Day 2 moderate risk for excessive rainfall, and a Day 1 high risk was issued on the 28th into the 29th. With the predictions understood by many, those in the path began preparing for the storm. Prior to Ian's arrival, the Cayman Islands requested assistance from the United Kingdom, who deployed a special operations team ahead of the storm, while stores, government offices, and schools closed. In Cuba, 50,000 people evacuated in the Pinar del Rio province. On September 24th, Florida Governor Ron DeSantis declared a state of emergency for the entire state, with other governors following suit soon after. This included Georgia Governor Brian Kemp, South Carolina Governor Henry McMaster, North Carolina Governor Roy Cooper, and Virginia Governor Glenn Youngkin. The same day, President Joe Biden approved Florida's emergency declaration, allowing federal assistance to help prepare for Ian. People scrambled to stores across Florida to gather supplies. In a grocery store in St. Petersburg, only empty cardboard boxes remained where the store normally stocked distilled water. Other necessities could still be found. Gas shortages were observed across the state as many hit the roads to evacuate in advance of Ian. The National Guard was activated and 2,000 troops from other states came in. Government offices, schools, public transit, and various businesses closed in anticipation of Ian. Outside of Florida, various NASCAR tracks opened up their campgrounds to evacuees, such as Talladega Superspeedway, Atlanta Motor Speedway, and Charlotte Motor Speedway. When Ian moved into the Gulf, other parts of the country began making preparations as well. In preparation for this video, I spoke with one of my patrons who was in Ian's path, Southwest Florida Elevators. He told me that he was keeping a close eye on the storm and decided to evacuate ahead of it.
So, like I said earlier, at the time we lived in a 2-bedroom manufactured home in Inglewood. It was me, my mom, and my brother. We originally were going to ride out the storm in the house because we knew it survived Charley, but our landlord was suggesting that we leave. Now, there was this Florida room we had with windows. One of them was stuck open slightly, so if I remember correctly, yeah, my mom went out to get this like sheet thingy to put over the window, and we did that, and we also got the other supplies we needed. The 27th rolls around when the hurricane warning was issued. At that point, I was starting to get weird feelings. With that advisory, the track had the storm making landfall in the Charlotte Harbor as a major hurricane. Then we got the evacuation orders issued for zones A and B. I get these texts from my county with their alerting program. I lived in Charlotte County. I still do. We were in zone B, and it also said all mobile and manufactured homes. We still decided to stay for now. My brother was saying we should leave. It wasn't until that night when my bad feelings were starting to get stronger. To be honest, I think that was God telling me that we needed to get out of there. And those feelings my brother was getting, the same thing. After looking at the 5 p.m. advisory that night, I did a lot of thinking. And then 8:30 p.m. that night, finally decided we needed to leave. So I went and told my mom that we needed to go. At that time, she was already thinking about leaving too. So she agreed, and we started packing our important stuff, like important documents and stuff like that. Now, we had a friend my mom helps every week in Northport at the time, and he was telling us that we should stay at his house. Well, he had gone to a shelter. So he had shutters up, and he recently had his roof done at the time. So we took up on that, and we went to his house. Before we left our house, we prayed that the house would be okay. At that point, that's when I teared up a little bit. My mom noticed it and asked me if I thought the house wasn't going to make it through the storm. I was like, I don't know. I don't want to think about it. So after a short final walk around the house, we left and went down to the house in Northport.
At first glance, the preparations seemed just like any other hurricane. However, problems were encountered that went unreported until after the storm made landfall. To understand how, prior to Ian's landfall, the situation in Florida ended up being a disaster of its own, we need to discuss Hurricane Charley and the population of Southwest Florida. When Hurricane Charley struck in 2004, it made landfall in Cayo Costa, then later Punta Gorda on the same day. There are 4 main counties that I want to go over: Sarasota, Charlotte, Lee, and Collier. In 2004, the population was roughly 350,000 for Sarasota County, 157,000 for Charlotte County, 520,000 for Lee County, and 296,000 for Collier County. Such high numbers cemented these areas as major population centers. But due to Charley's small size, the majority of the impact was isolated to near the core of the storm, primarily in Lee and Charlotte counties. In 2022, the populations of each area were 462,000 in Sarasota County, 202,000 in Charlotte County, 822,000 in Lee County, and 397,000 in Collier County. A total population growth of, carry the 1 and subtract that, divide by that, an approximate growth of 560,000 people. As of the 2020 census, the population of those 65 and older ranged from around 30 to 37% in those counties. Florida tends to be a common landing spot for retirees, such as obviously the case in Southwest Florida, with beautiful scenery and close proximity to the ocean. Put an asterisk next to perfect, as it's only ideal as long as you aren't in the direct path of a major hurricane. Local and county officials in Southwest Florida are aware of the dangers that major storms bring, and devote huge amounts of time and resources to preparing, with public education campaigns that include free preparedness guides, phone calls, door-to-door canvassing, and pre-registration for special needs evacuation shelters. Hurricane Ian showed that those efforts fell short. Janine Joy, the president and CEO of United Way of Lee, Hendry, and Glades counties, said the education is out there. As Floridians, we just think we've got it. This storm showed us that we don't. So, how exactly did those efforts fall short? Let's go over the issues that Southwest Florida residents faced, especially regarding the older population. Problem 1. The process of evacuating. For the majority of younger people, evacuating, while time-consuming and brutal, is a process that most are willing to undertake. The biggest problem arises when gas shortages and dense traffic make I-85 southbound through Atlanta look like a pleasant drive. For the elderly, the process of evacuating is nearly impossible. Not only do they have to deal with the previously mentioned challenges, they also encounter the high likelihood of health problems, lack of transportation due to said health problems, and, just based on my experience around my grandparents, stubborn-headedness. As a result, you end up in a situation where, to many, the process of evacuating seems like it has a higher risk than riding out the storm. That being said, even those who did wish to evacuate had very few options. Some care centers offered busing to those in the path. For example, in Pinellas County, the Senior Care Center team reached out to hundreds of people, arranging for school buses to bring them out of the flood zones. Unfortunately, those buses went mostly unused because of the residents' hesitance to evacuate, citing their own health or pet care needs as reasons to shelter in place. Those with physical or cognitive conditions chose to stay home because they feared ending up in nursing homes. An understandable reason, especially for those who previously were in nursing homes. In these areas, people are provided with additional resources to support life at home, as opposed to nursing homes or assisted living facilities. The one major trade-off is that those facilities have strict rules about keeping residents safe during hurricanes. The people who remain at home don't have the same level of protection. Now, the state of Florida has a plan laid out to help with this issue. Service agencies under contract with the State Department of Elder Affairs keep lists of people to help plan for storms, evacuate, and conduct welfare checks after the storm passes. County governments keep records of individuals that may require special needs shelters. However, those efforts reached fewer than 13,000 in a 7-county region with nearly 700,000 people over 60. Some had diagnosed cognitive decline, and that made it harder to plan ahead or make decisions whether or not to evacuate. Others had lost spouses or loved ones who handled those things, or they didn't have nearby family members or neighbors to ask for help. Crystal Rothar, the chief communications officer at the nonprofit Senior Friendship Centers, who helps people in 4 Southwest Florida counties prepare for hurricanes, stated they had notice. They knew days in advance. People were telling them to leave. But people don't realize that for older adults who are isolated in their homes and are trying to fly under the radar, it's extremely difficult to leave. This, on its own, is already bad enough. But there's more. Problem 2. Past storm experience and risk perception. Human nature tends to guide decision-making based on past experiences. And, in the case of Ian, it's one of the leading reasons for people's decision to shelter in place despite the heavy discouragement. We've seen this happen time and time again, with Katrina and Camille, and with Sandy and Irene, among other storms. So then with Ian, what was the big storm to compare this to? The obvious answer seemed to be Charlie. Contrary to this expectation, many who stayed expected Ian to play out more in line with Hurricane Irma from 2017, as that was the most recent comparable experience. For those unaware, Hurricane Irma was initially expected to make landfall on the southern coastline of Florida before going straight up through the peninsula. That forecast changed as it made landfall in Cuba and hugged the Cuban coastline, where it was then expected to make landfall in southwestern Florida near Lee County. Storm surge in areas around Fort Myers was expected to be around 6 to 10 feet, and 10 to 15 feet south of Fort Myers to the Keys, which included Naples. The day Irma made landfall, it was in Marco Island, Florida. The storm then made a jog to the east, came in at low tide, and produced 3 to 5 feet of surge in the Fort Myers region, including Lee and Charlotte counties. None of the deaths from Irma took place in Lee County, and the forecasted major storm surge event never took place. Not that 3 to 5 feet is any small amount. With that considered, individuals who experienced Irma said that what they went through 5 years prior influenced their decision to not flee for Ian. Many of those who evacuated for Irma returned to undamaged homes. According to resident Michael Yost, a lot of it came down to people who cried wolf too many times and nothing happened. Even if compared to Hurricane Charlie, its heaviest impacts were localized to a relatively small area, with few bearing the full brunt of the storm. There were also individuals who came in from other states that hadn't experienced a major hurricane before. Were there any major storms that came close to southwest Florida between Irma and Ian? Not really. I mean, the closest you got is Hurricane Elsa in 2021 and Hurricane Ada in 2020. Sorry, that was Ada when it devastated Central America. Ada 2020 when it was near Florida. Let me be clear here. Evacuation orders aren't perfect, and you can't just force people to leave ahead of a storm, as it's a huge waste of time and resources for first responders that can be used elsewhere to prepare for a storm. In terms of disaster preparedness, there is a degree of personal responsibility where it's the job of the people to stay up to date and aware of looming threats, equipping themselves with supplies and fortifying fragile components on their property. That being said, there are two sides to every coin, and the government plays its own role in keeping the people prepared. Local and state governments have a charge to clearly define and communicate storm threats, provide clear justification for evacuation orders, and prove that they are taking the system as seriously as those who are evacuating are. And I know there are people that will scream, the government isn't meant to help you. And my response to that is, providing options to those who have the most trouble evacuating helps lower potential death tolls. And politically, effective handling of a natural disaster wins people's votes, often shifting the potential results of an election. For example, when Andy Beshear won re-election in the 2023 Kentucky gubernatorial race, most of the counties that were impacted by the 2022 Eastern Kentucky flood shifted towards Beshear by anywhere from 1.48% to 12.13%. A swing like that in the span of 4 years is insane. One could argue the same thing for those affected by the 2021 Western Kentucky tornado. However, the shifts that went towards Bashir were not as high, ranging from 1.15% to 5.17%. There are a few outliers, mainly in Muhlenberg, Ohio, and McGuffin counties, but political scientists and journalists argue that the major shifts in those regions were likely due to Bashir's handling of those disasters. For as much crap as I'm about to unleash, the efforts that were successful likely prevented Ian's death toll from being higher. Most counties did what they could to illustrate the threat, and encouraged residents to leave at least 2 days in advance. In Charlotte County, aside from making the mistake of letting schools stay open the Monday before landfall, underwent public outreach efforts through workshops, social media, its website, and an emergency messaging system. While, according to experts, the decision to order an evacuation from a local government level is hard to get right, and no single person is to blame, it is also really hard to get it terribly, terribly wrong. I mean, imagine if there was a county that was in the direct bullseye for Ian, was told multiple days in advance that they were going to see a bad storm, proceeded to only issue an evacuation order a little over 24 hours before the storm actually makes landfall, and then proceed to refuse all questions when the conditions for a mandatory evacuation order being issued was met 3 days prior, and there was a leaked draft for an evacuation order that was made 12 hours prior to when the order was issued. Problem 3. Lee County, Florida, what the fuck? I'm gonna editorialize this opening bit for a moment. Rarely when I research for videos do I get genuinely pissed. I often get disappointed or sad, but when screw-ups happen, it's somewhat understandable. Maybe it's the first time a major disaster happened in that area, or there were so many underlying issues that go back decades, if not centuries, that criticizing officials, while warranted, rarely makes me want to punch through my monitor. This is one of those times where I want to punch through my monitor. Before I start going on a swearing spree, let's evaluate what actually happened. Discussions regarding what would become Ian go back to about a week before landfall, when the National Weather Service began talking with Lee County Emergency Management about the potential risk coming with the developing storm. The first major action taken for Lee County goes back to September 24th, where Governor Ron DeSantis declared a state of emergency for the entirety of the state. And, shortly thereafter, President Biden signed off on a requested emergency declaration for 24 counties and 2 Native American tribes. Surprise, surprise, included in that list was Lee County. The state of emergency in Florida allowed for the National Guard to be deployed, reduced red tape that blocks off resources requiring approval from other branches of government, activated emergency mitigation, response, and recovery procedures established by the state, and local and interjurisdictional emergency management plans. This also provides the ability to utilize all available resources of the state government, including directing evacuation orders. At the time, the forecast cone suggested that Ian would make landfall anywhere from the Forgotten Coast to Key West. Then it got more complex when the cone of uncertainty ranged from the Panhandle to Southwest Florida. Issuing a mandatory evacuation order for such a large part of the state with such a high level of uncertainty when the storm is 4 days out is understandable. Keep in mind that county governments also have the ability to declare mandatory evacuation orders. Local counties in Southwest Florida began issuing mandatory evacuation orders ahead of Ian on September 26th. Not Lee County though, no. Officials were still waiting to issue one because Ian's path was still uncertain. This would be questionable at best if the data they were receiving didn't contradict the emergency management plan, which calls for evacuation orders depending on the projected max storm surge height and the probability of said height. According to the New York Times, based on the forecast from Sunday night, models showed a chance of a storm surge covering much of Cape Coral and Fort Myers, with parts of Fort Myers Beach having a 40% chance of a 6-foot high surge. Monday forecasts were more dire, with many areas of Cape Coral and Fort Myers having between a 10 and a 40% chance of a storm surge above 6 feet, with some areas possibly seeing a surge of more than 9 feet. Based on the surge evacuation decision-making matrix by the Lee County Emergency Management Department, that would call for an evacuation of Zone A by default and potentially Zone B. In that case, a mandatory evacuation order should have been issued. right? That's because the matrix in question is non-binding, meaning that the plan is not required to be enforced. But that's still an issue when an official government document plan contradicts the messaging, even if it is non-binding. According to Lee County officials, they said they will issue an evacuation order when they have more information. Meanwhile, most of the counties around them had already begun issuing orders. In fact, Lee County Manager Roger DeSarle said to reporters in a 3 p.m. news conference, and I am quoting him directly, "A couple days ago, Fort Myers, Lee County was right in the very center of the cone of uncertainty. And that's really the best place to be 3-4 days out because the storm will never ever behave that way." I should have just stuck to Geometry Dash commentary videos. By the 5 p.m. update, the National Hurricane Center became more direct, stating the highest risk for life-threatening storm surge was in the area from Fort Myers to Tampa Bay. New modeling showed that Fort Myers was more likely than not to receive at least 6 feet of surge. Despite that, Lee County officials waited until the next morning to issue a partial evacuation order before expanding it later that morning. At 7 a.m., DeSarle issued an evacuation order for Zone A, expanding it to Zone B at 8:30 a.m., landing at the exact time Ian's outer bands were in full force, and on a day with a threat of associated tornadoes. This was far too late considering that a study from the Southwest Florida Regional Planning Council stated it would take roughly 36 hours to evacuate all of Zone A. Not only that, but the Fort Myers jail wasn't evacuated either. The failure to evacuate jails is nothing new in tropical cyclones. It has happened before, but it just adds on to this whole mess. Then, around 2 p.m., DeSarle said,
"I don't recall the last time that we had to manage a hurricane that was as difficult as this one. And we now find ourselves in a position of great peril in Lee County."
This is coming from the same guy who said that hurricanes never ever behave how they do 3 to 4 days out when Lee County was smack dab in the middle of the cone. The jokes write themselves, folks. What if I told you it somehow got worse? In December 2022, CBS News affiliate for Southwest Florida, Wink TV, obtained an email between county staff and the county's public safety director, Sandra Tapfumene, which was sent at 7:03 p.m. on September 26th. A draft of an evacuation order. If the evacuation order was made on Monday night, the Planning Council's recommended allotted time to safely evacuate would have been met. For weeks, Wink investigative reporter Peter Flashier called, emailed, and stopped by county offices to request interviews from officials, and they all refused, until they eventually spoke outside their office. Roger DeSarle said that they believed the storm surge was going to have more of an effect on the uninhabited areas of Zone A, and that's why they were a little slower to pull that trigger than we might have otherwise. Commissioner Ray Sandelli pointed out that there are a number of different factors involved, and admitted they maybe could have handled it differently. Then there was the chairman of the commission, Cecil Pendergrass. He refused to discuss holding the evacuation order or even the evacuation protocols entirely. Instead, he called Wink News fake news and claimed his office issued statements via email about the topic. Turns out, he never sent any emails. County Communication Director Betsy Clayton and Public Safety Director Sandra Tapfumene also declined to be interviewed. Lee County made an after-action report and stated that the timing of the evacuation orders aligned with the county's pre-existing plans. As to what the plan was, it was activating an EOC on the 23rd, then an SOLE on the 26th, enabling emergency authorities and procurement policies countywide. But that's all that's listed. If there is any reason as to why it could have possibly been delayed, is that Lee County wasn't in a hurricane warning until the 27th. But that is a terrible excuse. Kevin Runane, a Lee County commissioner, said after the fact that an extensive evacuation order was postponed because they thought the worst of the storm would be further north. A sentiment echoed by Governor DeSantis, who stated that there is a difference between a storm that is going to hit North Florida that will have peripheral effects on your region versus one that is making a direct impact. And so what I saw in Southwest Florida is, as the data changed, they sprung into action. While DeSantis does make a point, again regardless of a direct landfall, the potential for significant storm surge was noted as early as Sunday night. Those who were waiting for an evacuation order before leaving, which wasn't a lot, said to news outlets that it was issued far too late, with people like Catherine Morong driving through torrential downpours and in between tornado warnings. Some, such as Donna Ferguson, said by the time she got home to prepare to evacuate, it was too late. Others said that they didn't receive any evacuation notice at all. Editorializing this again. To finish this off, I want to state that I'm not claiming that coordinating an evacuation effort is easy. Dear Lord, it is the opposite of that. All the counties I mentioned earlier who are major population centers had to deal with an older population that struggled to get out, and numerous people who were stubborn based on previous storm experience or personal beliefs about the risks a storm brings to them and their families. There is a strong level of perceptive, personal responsibility there. In comparison, evacuation orders aren't based on personal responsibility. It is the jobs of local officials to warn their population of the threat a storm like Ian poses. Nearly every other county around Lee County issued an order a day before it did. And when Lee County finally did, they downplayed it by saying it's only a small part of Zone A before realizing the storm's true scope and then drastically changing their tone. It's unclear whether the evacuation order would have meant anything in the long run regarding the death toll, but studies suggest that those who received a mandatory evacuation order from their county government were far more likely to evacuate than those who received a voluntary order or no evacuation order. As to how many more people would have left, I have no idea, but there are people who likely would have listened is what I'm getting at. However, some inferred the delayed evacuation effort as a sign that officials didn't see a big threat. While that occurred because both Lee and Charlotte counties kept their schools open 2 days before Ian arrived, one can infer that the sentiment was worse in Lee County, given that they waited a day after Charlotte County to issue an evacuation order. As one resident said to the Washington Post, "If officials are not concerned, and that's who we're supposed to have our trust in because that's who we voted for, then we think it must be okay." I just want to bring this up because I know someone will just based on what I've seen in comment sections on this topic. Some argue that this whole controversy stems from wanting to politicize the aftermath of this storm. I disagree, and I want to mention why I'm so heated about this. I'm not that mad that mistakes happened when preparing for a storm that was extremely difficult to pinpoint where the worst impacts would be for multiple days before landfall, especially when the worst case scenario is determined by miles. In fact, I'd be more surprised if no mistakes happened. There is a genuine fear of being overly cautious and causing a boy who cried wolf effect. As I will get into later, people are just unaware that the effects of a tropical cyclone can extend far away from its center. I do not believe that the local officials were deliberately trying to put people in harm's way due to this mishap. I'm only angry about this because when confronted about criticisms of the evacuation order being issued too late, with the exception of a few, Lee County officials refused to elaborate on why they issued their evacuation orders late for weeks, as if they had something to hide. Only commenting after enough pressure from local media outlets, and while they admitted they could have done something different, some of their reasoning contradicted data based on their own plans that they had laid out. And then there was Cecil Pendergrass, who said the reports were fake news and refused to answer questions because reasons. To give credit where credit is due, when Hurricane Milton happened a few weeks ago, Lee County began issuing evacuation orders about 2.5 days before Milton eventually made landfall. So it seems like they have learned from their mistakes. Thus concludes the issues with the evacuations. Regardless of the actions or inaction taken ahead of the storm, Ian was on track to become a monster. Hey, this is mid-edit Alferia here, just a quick note I want to mention. I got some comments about this when I posted this on my community page. The issues extend further than what I mentioned here. People were saying that issues extended to a lot of other counties. I would have gone even deeper on this, but the segment is extremely long enough as is, and so I'm just gonna end this here. Anyways, back to the video. After being named, Ian initially struggled with moderate to strong vertical wind shear limiting its intensification, preventing alignment of the low and mid-level centers while the storm moved over the Caribbean Sea south of Jamaica. Ian began to turn northwestward on September 25th, and later that day, convection near its core started to coalesce, and the storm began to rapidly intensify at 18 UTC, when it moved around the southwestern periphery of a subtropical ridge to its north. Ian became a hurricane about 100 nautical miles south-southwest of Grand Cayman Island at 5 a.m. Eastern Daylight Time on September 26th, and would continue to intensify until landfall, becoming a major hurricane at 2 a.m. the next day. On September 27th at 4:30 a.m., Ian came ashore near La Coloma in the Pinar del Rio province of Cuba, with maximum sustained winds of 125 miles per hour and a minimum central pressure of 947 millibars. Storm surge inundated the coastline, peaking between 8 and 10 feet, and going as far as a fifth of a mile inland. Media outlets reported maximum rainfall totals of over 20 inches, causing severe flooding. Ian weakened slightly as it passed over Cuba, with the center of the storm emerging over the warm waters of the Gulf of Mexico at around 10 a.m. Conditions were perfect for the storm to strengthen as it moved towards the north-northeast, between the western side of a subtropical ridge and a broad trough over the eastern United States. Shortly after moving back over water, Ian underwent an eyewall replacement cycle, expanding its wind field and radii of maximum winds. At 10 p.m., Ian moved over the dry Tortugas with winds of 125 miles per hour. It then underwent rapid intensification once more as it moved closer to the Florida coastline. At 8 a.m., September 28th, Ian became a Category 5 hurricane, with maximum sustained winds of 160 miles per hour and a minimum central pressure of 937 millibars, becoming the first Category 5 in the Atlantic Basin since 2019's Hurricane Lorenzo, and the first in the Gulf of Mexico since Hurricane Michael in 2018. More hostile conditions in the Gulf led to the system slightly losing steam during its approach to land. At 2:05 p.m. Eastern Daylight Time, Hurricane Ian made landfall on Cayo Costa, Florida, with maximum sustained winds of 150 miles per hour and a minimum central pressure of 941 millibars. The exact same location as Hurricane Charlie made landfall, and at the exact same strength and intensity. However, Ian would end up causing much more destruction than Charlie due to two reasons: size and speed. Charlie's tropical storm wind field went out about 60 nautical miles, and its hurricane wind field went out about 15. Its forward speed at landfall was 20 miles per hour. It was a small, compact, fast-moving storm. In comparison, Hurricane Ian's tropical storm wind field went out about 130 to 135 nautical miles, and its hurricane force wind field extended outward to about 35 nautical miles. Its forward speed at landfall was less than 10 miles per hour. The TLDR is that Ian was a larger and slower moving storm than Charlie. What that resulted in was more rainfall and storm surge just by virtue of being both larger and slower, blowing the 2004 numbers out of the water. Peak storm surge values from Ian were recorded between 10 and 15 feet in the Fort Myers area, with high surge ranging from 6 to 9 feet in areas such as Naples, Pine Island, Cape Coral, and other communities. Oddly enough, a negative storm surge event happened in Tampa Bay, where water was being pulled back into the ocean. Residents who pledged to stay scrambled to get on their rooftops as high surge rushed inland. Numerous were unable to. At the Fort Myers jail, according to inmates, toilets were overflowing with waste. Fires were reported, and the jail refused to evacuate after being urged to, only doing so after the storm had passed. Ian, despite the similar strength and intensity, was nothing like Charlie at landfall. An hour and a half after its first landfall in Florida, Ian came ashore on the Florida mainland, with maximum sustained winds of 145 miles per hour and a pressure of 945 millibars. Southwest Florida elevators, who evacuated northward, still felt Ian's wrath firsthand.
So, on the morning of the 28th, I woke up around 6:30 in the morning. We had gotten settled in that house I told you about earlier. I was getting these alerts on my phone that saying leave now if you are in evacuation levels A and B. This is for Sarasota County. Now, I come to find out that Ian has strengthened into a Category 4 hurricane after the eye replacement cycle, after hitting Cuba earlier. At the time, they designated it as a Category 4 with winds of 150 miles an hour, if I remember. The winds were already picking up around in that area And around 11, I saw the first extreme wind warning for Lee County. And probably around noon or so, maybe before that, the power finally went out. I already knew the power was going to go out anyway, so I needed to get as much information as possible. So 2 p.m. rolls around. The winds were probably exceeding around 100 miles an hour, and stuff was already being blown around. Garbage cans flying and all that. And I told you about the extreme wind warning. And then 4 p.m. was when the full brunt came around. 130 miles per hour winds or so, and he had this fence in the backyard. It was starting to come down. Like, as the stronger the winds got, the more it came down. And then there's also this massive tree. Eventually, the winds were blowing south. The lanai I was standing in at the time was facing south, so the winds were blowing away from me, like in the other direction. And eventually, that tree fell away from the house. So I stood in a lanai for a while, and to the point where I couldn't, so I decided to go back in. Now, the winds kept howling till about 10 o'clock when it finally started to slow down a little bit. Before that, there was a flash flood emergency that I gotten issued that was the first time that NWS Ruskin had ever issued one, by the way. That time we had no idea how bad it was back at home or what had happened at Fort Myers Beach with the storm surge. So yeah, we were away from the coast. Yeah, a little bit further north. So yeah, that was pretty much the gist of what happened with our experience with Ian.
Over the course of the next several hours, Ian weakened over the Floridian Peninsula, re-emerging over the Atlantic Ocean at 8 a.m. the next day as a tropical storm. Of course, during its journey across the peninsula, Ian's inland flooding was historic. Across the central part of the state, widespread rainfall totals of 7 to 10 inches were recorded, and plenty of places had rainfall totals exceeding a foot. The maximum rainfall total in Florida was 26.95 inches in Grove City. Numerous flash flood warnings and flash flood emergencies were issued as rivers started to crest at historic levels that were set by previous storms. Much of Ian's convection was displaced to the north of its center while Ian moved northward, but not before re-strengthening into a hurricane by 2 p.m. on September 29th. The storm accelerated in its movement speed and made its final landfall near Georgetown, South Carolina, with maximum sustained winds of 80 miles per hour and a minimum central pressure of 978 millibars at 2:05 p.m. on September 30th. Ian produced 3 to 7 inches of rainfall across North and South Carolina, with localized amounts of 7 to 10 inches. Storm surge values peaked between 4 to 6 feet along the South Carolinian coast, and 3 to 5 feet along the southernmost part of the North Carolinian coast. Shortly after landfall, Ian merged with a front over North Carolina, transitioning to an extratropical cyclone by 5 p.m. 12 hours later, surface, radar, and satellite imagery indicated that Ian had dissipated, and a separate mid-latitude low had formed to the northeast. Ian's journey had concluded, but what it had done over the course of its time on this earth was cemented in the history books as one of the most devastating hurricanes in the Atlantic Basin. Thankfully, Jamaica and the Cayman Islands were spared from the worst of Ian. There was some minor surge flooding, heavy rain, and gusty winds. Ian's trek near the Cayman Islands came roughly 2 weeks after the 18-year anniversary of Hurricane Ivan's wrath of terror on Grand Cayman. Ironic, considering Ian's name was the generational replacement after both Ivan and Igor had been retired. Out of all of the Caribbean islands, Cuba was hit the worst. The streets of the city of Pinar del Rio was littered with metal rooftops, power lines, and bits and pieces of trees. The province was home to much of the tobacco used in Cuban cigars. The farms suffered extensive damage. The owner of the Finca Robina cigar farm posted photos onto Twitter, stating it was apocalyptic, a real disaster. The biggest impact to Cuba was to the power grid. Initially, only those facing Ian's direct impacts were losing power, but all of a sudden, the nation's entire power grid collapsed, plunging the island into darkness. The cause? Ian knocked out one of the country's main power plants and it couldn't be brought back online. The Antonio Gutierrez thermoelectric power plant could not be synchronized, according to a journalist with a state-run news agency. That plant is one of the most important in the country. The lack of electricity also meant that water was unavailable in many areas relying on pumps. Authorities worked to restore service in the eastern part of the country, but the efforts slowed down once they got closer to where Ian made landfall. By Thursday, protests began breaking out in Havana with residents demanding power be restored. The Florida Keys dealt with uprooted trees and heavy street flooding. In central Florida, Ian's torrential downpours caused historic flooding. Numerous flash flood warnings and flash flood emergencies were issued, as multiple rivers such as the St. Johns River, Little Wakiva River, and Shingle Creek reached historic crests. The results of said flooding were evident across inland Florida, with water submerging roadways and vehicles. Numerous locations across DeSoto County were underwater. Unlike the storm surge, the river flooding from Ian lasted for multiple weeks, and the worst of it came after Ian had dissipated, as runoff converged into the rivers that were already overwhelmed. In South Carolina, major flooding occurred in Charleston, with residents mentioning through tweets and interviews that the water levels were some of the highest they had seen in some time. Surge flooding occurred along the coastline, breaching dunes and cutting 6-foot-high cliffs into the beaches. Yet, the area hit the worst was southwest Florida. Some locals weren't expecting much from Ian. They had been spared during Irma, and Charlie's wrath was limited to a very small part of the coastline. What was the worst that could happen? The answer? The costliest disaster in Florida state history, and the deadliest hurricane in the state since the 1935 Labor Day hurricane.
Good evening, everyone. Tonight, Florida has been rocked back on its heels. The light of day revealing a landscape that to many is barely recognizable. Already tonight, hundreds of people have been rescued, but so many more are unaccounted for. And so there is a growing sense of dread about those who couldn't or wouldn't get out ahead of the storm, as rescuers from across the country answer the call for help.
Across the southwestern coast of Florida, the appearance of a summer paradise was gone, replaced with what looked like a war zone. Roads were flooded, and areas like Port Charlotte were struck with severe wind damage. Lee County to the south, though, bore the worst of it. In Cape Coral, power poles were down across the city, and yachts along the coast were pushed inland by storm surge. Destructive winds and surge battered downtown Fort Myers, causing widespread flooding. The areas hit the worst were San Carlos Island, Sanibel Island, Pine Island, and Fort Myers Beach. At San Carlos Island, a car was placed on top of a pile of debris right next to the water, with numerous boats wrecked onto the coastline behind it. Water reached the second stories of multiple buildings, washing away most of what was present below. The congregation hall for a local church was left with pieces of debris littering what was left of the floor. At Sanibel Island, the causeway was washed out. The only method of getting to and from the island by car was gone. Residents who rode out the storm were left stranded for 2 days, as state officials rushed to try and get a temporary bridge up. Local officials couldn't even describe the scope of the damage. According to Governor DeSantis, he said that he saw concrete utility poles split in half. The town of Madlacha, located on Pine Island, was gone. The bridge to the Cape Coral Fort Myers area was washed out, and the majority of Pine Island was left resembling a war zone instead of a tropical paradise. Similarly to Sanibel Island, people were left stranded for 2 days as government officials scrambled to get survivors off the island by boat or by air. Then there was Fort Myers Beach. Houses that were on pilings stood no match, washed out and left as a mess of debris. Other houses were left barely standing, including one house that had its roof collapsed onto itself, and one house where almost all the walls were gone, with the sole exception of one of the back corners, including the closet and a mattress that stood next to where a wall fell, and another house that was flattened by the roof. A local 7-Eleven was washed out, debris scattered about the station, its roof left barely standing with the support of some exterior and interior walls. Photos from the air truly painted the picture of how widespread the devastation was in the town. Residential neighborhoods sustained significant damage, with roofs damaged and some houses wiped out entirely. But the visuals of the damage left behind are only part of the story. There were also the testimonies that survivors gave to local and national news outlets. Chris Brucci, an employee at Port Charlotte Hampton Inn and a Desert Storm veteran, told Fox 4 News, "The day of the storm was the scariest moment of my life." In Fort Myers Beach, Damon Utterback rode out the storm in his home, not expecting the storm to be severe. His fiancée stood up on top of a grill to keep her head above the water, as the surge flooded their residence. The fiancée survived. Utterback got trapped trying to open a window and ultimately drowned. Sanibel Island resident Greg Iannarino was trapped on Sanibel Island. He told Local 10 News, "I was with these cats in the back bedroom, and I actually saw the roof lift off, and then 10 feet of water came in. The only thing I have left is my 3 cats, and whatever I have left that's on my suitcase." At the Lee County Jail in Fort Myers, toilets were overflowing with human waste, and the jail staff didn't have sufficient medication for inmates, meaning those on psych meds were cold turkey. The hardest stories to swallow were those of 2 old men in their 70s. Both survived the storm, but took their own lives upon seeing the devastation that Ian had brought to Lee County. To see what was once your home completely destroyed is a sight nobody wants to observe. And for those 2, including 4 others in the state of Florida, it was simply too much. But then there were those who came back to see what was left. Southwest Florida Elevators came back to his home to find it destroyed.
So we left that house around 7:45 in the morning on the 29th. So we started to make our way back to Inglewood. Northport was flooded. Like, there were washed out roads. Roads that I never knew flooded. We had to turn around a couple times, and eventually, about an hour and a half or so later, we finally got into the Inglewood area. Now, we still had no idea what had happened at Fort Myers Beach or even back at home. We then got on the main road that leads to our street. There was a tree down on the way. We were able to get around it. But as we got closer to our street, all 3 of us, my mom, my brother, and myself, got this feeling that something was wrong. So we approached the street we turn on before we turn on our street, and we lived in this was a neighborhood of manufactured homes. We saw that most of them had been damaged or completely destroyed. All of us got this instinct that we knew the house didn't make it. And when we finally got on our street, I think my brother was the one who saw it first. There was our house. Destroyed. More than just damaged. We were lost for words. So we pulled in and ran to see what the full extent was, and let's just say words could not describe. Let's just say we were shell-shocked, to say the least. So the kitchen was blown out. There's a wall right in the kitchen on the let's see, it's the northwest side of the house. I think it faces northwest. It was on our driveway. It was on our driveway. The roof was gone. The front was blown in by the winds. It was again blowing south. The Florida room was gone. The bedrooms were still standing, but the ceilings caved in. The only thing that survived was the shed we had, which was on the southwest side of the house, or south side. It was concrete, so obviously, but I think it did flood on the inside. But regardless, it was just devastation. We started to salvage what we could, and we brought them back to the house. We rode the storm, and that's where we stayed for about 3 months after the storm until we got to our current spot. So the days fall, we made trips out cleaning up and salvaging what we could. Again, and then later we found out what had happened at Fort Myers Beach with the storm surge.
Southwest Florida was paradise no more, but for residents across the region, help was starting to come in from government officials and from citizens across the nation. On September 29th, 2022, President Biden signed a federal disaster declaration for the state of Florida. On the ground, officials worked to get to those stranded on the barrier islands. Members of the U.S. Coast Guard, National Guard, and local law officials began search and rescue, going by boat and air to rescue survivors. Off the coast, the U.S. Border Patrol saved Cuban migrants who attempted to make it to Florida by boat, only for Hurricane Ian to sink it. Not all those on the boat survived. Curfews were put in place and some were arrested for looting in Lee County, while a man from Houston was arrested for doing unlicensed repair work. Governor DeSantis proved that he was able to respond effectively to a disaster like Ian, which was the first major hurricane to strike Florida during his tenure as governor. Under his leadership, a temporary bridge to Sanibel Island was built in just a few weeks, a project that many thought was going to take months. He spent numerous hours meeting with emergency management teams, surveying damage, talking privately with victims, calling lawmakers, accepting aid, and cooperating with Democratic governors. He even visited and served food at a Waffle House in Charlotte County for victims. DeSantis gave high praise to the Biden administration's assistance with helping the state of Florida during the disaster. DeSantis talked with Biden multiple times over the course of several days, and appreciated the aid that was given to the state. Biden himself, who visited Fort Myers and toured the damage with DeSantis, praised the governor for their extraordinary cooperation. At a news conference, Biden said, "What the governor's done is pretty remarkable. I think he's done a good job." DeSantis returned the compliments as well.
I think one of the things that you're seeing in this response, we are cutting through the bureaucracy. We are cutting through the red tape, and that's from local government, state government, all the way up to the president. So we appreciate the team effort. So, Mr. President, welcome to Florida. We appreciate working together across various levels of government, and the floor is yours.
With the sole exception of the evacuation shenanigans, and even then, that was more so on the local government than the state, given how other counties issued the orders earlier, DeSantis was able to put politics aside and bring in a showing of strong bipartisanship during a time that desperately needed it. It wasn't just the words talking, it was the actions he took to genuinely talk with and help victims that were hit the hardest. It truly stands out as a governor who cares for those impacted by the storms that hit his people. This may seem like a no-duh statement to make, but given how he was able to stop the fiery rhetoric that he was going with on a dime to help people in need in his state, he showed that he had the maturity and empathy needed of a leader. His response was also a liability in the future in case he fumbled the bag with future disasters. I mean, what's the chances of that happening? This video isn't on those two subjects, so that's where that train of thought ends. Outside of the political realm, charities and people across the nation came to help. During the storm, many called Mike Murphy, a businessman, a hero after he saved upwards of 27 lives, 10 dogs, and a cat from Ian's surge, by getting on a boat and getting as many as he could on board to prevent them from being swept away. Across the regions hit the hardest, locals came together to support each other. In Northport, Jane DeClerc, a water safety instructor and lead lifeguard, went to help other people before themselves. People across Harlem Heights went to the local food pantry to help provide food and water to anyone who needed them. Numerous local and national charities came in to help, such as Publix Charities, the Florida Disaster Fund, Convoy of Hope, Save the Children, and Operation Barbecue Relief. The storm was over, but now all people could do was try and return to some form of normalcy. Yet, there's two impacts and topics related to Hurricane Ian that need to be discussed before I tie this up in a bow with a Where Are They Now segment. The NHC forecasting cone criticisms and Saffir-Simpson scale. Many across the media and locals alike began critiquing and throwing criticisms at how the forecast for Hurricane Ian was handled. A lot of it dealt with the cone of uncertainty and how Ian perceived its threat. But first, I'll give a quick recap of how the forecast cone works. The forecast cone is unofficially referred to as the cone of uncertainty. How it works is that the cone itself is a visualization of a consensus of a bunch of different model runs that show where the direct center of the storm will be at a given point in time. Given that hurricanes are large systems, it's implied that those who are close to the cone, even if they aren't in it, will receive impacts of some kind depending on the storm. However, many in the general public do not interpret the cone that way. They interpret the cone as a general range of impacts, and that the storm will go straight through the center of the cone. While Ian's landfall point was in the cone at all times at the southern edge of it, people misinterpreted the tool by itself. In a way, it's up to broadcast meteorologists, and meteorologists in general, to use the tool and give a proper forecast. However, in the age of social media, many just look at the cone without understanding how it works. As Craig Setzer, a broadcast meteorologist in Miami, said, "As much as we have told people that hazards extend outside the cone, which is almost a disclaimer, people don't perceive that." The biggest issue comes down to what the cone forecasts by itself: the storm's future strength through the Saffir-Simpson hurricane wind scale. The Saffir-Simpson scale works as a strength scale. It's proven to do so time and time again. But as the sole interpreter of the risks that a storm proposes, it is awful. Wind strength does a good enough job at the highest end of the scale to get the point across, but it doesn't all the time. In the case of Ian, we have another storm that made landfall at the exact same strength and pressure at the exact same location: Charlie. Both were rated the exact same on the Saffir-Simpson scale, yet the outcomes were drastically different. To meteorologists, the answer as to why there were two separate outcomes are obvious. Ian was larger and slower. But to the general public, they often just look at the category itself. The Saffir-Simpson scale doesn't take into account storm surge potential or inland flooding. While you can infer that storm surge will be higher with a stronger storm, you cannot say the same thing for flooding. This has been further reinforced by storms that have occurred since then, notably Hurricane Helene, which utterly destroyed vast portions of western North Carolina and eastern Tennessee due to record-breaking floods. Multiple proposals have been made to fix the issue at hand. With the cone issue, the National Hurricane Center is rolling out a new format for cones that show inland warnings and watches for tropical cyclones. That alone helps with the issue of illustrating how the storm's impacts go way further past the center, since it's now including inland areas. It's something that national media outlets have been doing for a while at this point, so kinda goes without saying that the NHC would follow. The graphic is a bit messy, but it's experimental, so that goes without saying. However, that still doesn't tell the whole story. What about areas hit by the remnants of storm systems that end up causing extreme flooding, like what happened with Ida in 2021? There are a ton of other impacts to consider. There is some level of personal responsibility here. However, the problem is that the interpretation of said threat a storm possesses with the Saffir-Simpson scale and the forecast cone, in its current state, is being wildly misinterpreted. As to the Saffir-Simpson scale, that isn't changing for now since it's a strength scale and it works. There are calls that basing it on atmospheric pressure better illustrates the true strength a storm possesses, and while I agree it's better, trying to explain a millibar to your average American will probably make their head explode. The best solution to that is that meteorologists need to overcome the barriers made in the age of social media, but that has its own hurdles. Honestly, the idea of a completely separate scale based entirely on the potential impacts it brings is something I'd bring to the table, like a cyclone destruction potential scale. Oh yeah, my friend Apollo already made that. I may talk about that idea in an editorial later down the line. As for the topic of the cone and forecast changes, the National Hurricane Center has heard the criticisms and is trying to adjust the way the cone is illustrated. As for the other big topic, we gotta talk about insurance companies. Across the country, home insurance companies have been pulling out of states such as California. In Florida, that occurred in 2023, where major insurance companies such as Farmers Insurance pulled out of the state. Florida's housing insurance crisis is a dumpster fire that even I have no idea how to tackle, so I'm gonna paraphrase from the various sources here since most of this is out of my area of expertise. If you want more information on the crisis as a whole, there are these two MSNBC clips and the video by a more perfect union that I will link in the description. So why is this happening? Money and greed. It's insurance companies. Honestly, what else were you expecting? While numbers vary, Hurricane Ian cost US insurers approximately $63 billion. A lot of money from a singular storm. Ian isn't an outlier either. Multiple single events have cost insurance companies billions, and the insurance companies haven't been keeping up. To be fair, insurance premiums have been a problem in Florida for a while. With the increased risk of hurricanes, premiums in the state, especially along the coast, have gotten more and more expensive. The only way they respond to these disasters in their current business model is to cut policies and raise premiums. What they ended up doing as well was pointing to the fine print, saying that properties didn't have flood or wind damage protections in their insurance policy. Basically what people thought was already in their home insurance plan. To be fair, hurricanes are a disaster that is covered in typical home insurance. However, there is a major catch to that. Flood insurance isn't really on most of the lists that contain basic home insurance protections. What is deemed as flood damage is damage that results from water rising from the ground up and into a residence. Fun fact, did you know that storm surge technically comes from the ground and rises up? So by sheer technicality, insurance companies were able to deny damages caused by storm surge by categorizing it as flood damage instead of hurricane damage. And hurricane-caused flooding, in general, is not put under the hurricane level, despite the fact the hurricane caused the storm surge and flooding. Few actually have flood insurance in Florida. Some overlook that their policies didn't include it, and many believe they didn't need it since their houses never flooded before. Even for those who had their properties insured, a number of victims didn't get their money, and even those who did got it really late. In fact, in late September of this year, CBS News broke a story from multiple whistleblowers that claimed that insurance companies altered damage reports to underpay homeowners. But those who were left without insurance are now at risk of having their mortgage rates increased or even losing them on top of the obvious problems that could arise if you don't have home insurance. So what do they go to? The state-run insurance, Citizens Property Insurance. In a perfect world, I'd end it here, but there's a lot that happened in 2022. Originally, Citizens Property was more expensive than private insurers to make it the last resort like it was intended to be. In 2007, the state legislature amended the rules of Citizens to make that rule obsolete, infuriating insurance companies. Major rule changes to the state-run insurance plan stopped there for a while until you've gotta be kidding me. During DeSantis' time as governor, insurance companies lobbied the governor and state legislature to essentially kick people off of Citizens insurance and make it harder for citizens to sue insurers when they failed to do the job that they got paid to do. In 2022, those bills were passed and signed into law. So how did the state government react to insurers like farmers pulling out of Florida after 2022 and into 2023? Not very well. Instead of understanding and adapting to the situation they had already made worse for themselves, Florida Chief Financial Officer publicly attacked Farmers Insurance for being woke, saying that Farmers was on its way to becoming the Bud Light of insurance. So who's left to provide insurance? Well, multiple smaller insurance companies with basically no history, including Slide Insurance, founded by one of the lawyers for Enron. Slide had people kicked off of Citizens and placed on their insurance policies, roughly quadrupling premium rates for those customers. They also got the policies that originally went for other companies that had just pulled out, pretty much screwing everyone over. Florida's insurance crisis has been building for a long time. It just so happened that Irma weakened before its landfall, still a major disaster in Florida, but not as bad as it could have been. The worst area hit during Michael wasn't very populated, and Dorian stalled over the Bahamas instead of the Floridian coastline. Ian was the first time that a major hurricane hit a densely populated area near its peak intensity, where the impacts were widespread in quite some time for the state. However, the impacts on Florida homeowners along the coast due to the insurance crisis are notable. Most of the redevelopment in areas hit the hardest by Ian is being done by wealthy investors building rental units and worsening the affordable housing crisis that is rocking the entire country. Now, some Florida lawmakers are trying to address this, especially after Ian's financial impacts, by strengthening citizens' insurance. However, that requires the Florida state legislature to pass actually beneficial policy instead of trying to be, well, Florida. But it's been roughly 2 years since Ian, so one must ask, how are the areas hit the hardest doing today? In September 2022, Hurricane Ian cemented itself as the hallmark storm of the Atlantic hurricane season. With maximum sustained winds of 160 miles per hour and a minimum central pressure of 937 millibars. It was a beast in strength. Ian killed 161, 5 in Cuba, 5 in North Carolina, 1 in Virginia, and 150 in Florida, becoming the deadliest hurricane to strike the state since the 1935 Labor Day hurricane. The storm caused $113 billion in damages, becoming the costliest actual disaster in Florida history, and the third costliest hurricane in the Atlantic Basin, only behind Hurricanes Harvey and Katrina, at least at the time of recording this. Due to the death and devastation that Ian caused in Florida, Cuba, and the Carolinas, the name Ian was retired and replaced with the name Idris for use in the 2028 Atlantic hurricane season. Roughly 2 years later, a few things have happened. The Fort Myers elevator shaft in Times Square, one of the few buildings that survived the storm, was painted by local artists and turned into a monument. Outside of that, the signs of Hurricane Ian's fury on the southwest coastline is still eerily obvious. Going through Google Maps, you can obviously tell where buildings once stood, and fences surround buildings that are now uninhabited. Across the coastline, outside developers have been coming in, buying up properties and proposing for new lavish buildings as either rentals or hotels. Speaking of, multiple residents across various municipalities are still struggling. A lot. Forced to wait on insurance claims to go through. Even outside of that, housing costs across Southwest Florida have spiked massively, forcing residents to leave their homes and move elsewhere. Many have felt left out, and without a path forward. There are some bits of good news, however. Local businesses have begun reopening, such as the island's Pancake House, and longtime residents have been adamant in staying. They love Southwest Florida, and to them, the landscape and community outweighs the cost of paradise to them. Not to mention, who exactly would they be selling their houses to? Frickin' Aquaman? Hurricane Ian was a terror to behold. An experience that very few can relate to on a personal level. Nearly 2 years later, Hurricane Ian is a storm that the residents of Cuba, Florida, and the Carolinas will not forget. And it's a storm that I will not forget anytime soon. Everything I just wrote above was written in August or September of this year. There's a major amendment I need to make to this segment, and it's the major elephant in the room. In the past month, both Hurricane Helene and Milton have wrought havoc to the southeastern United States. And in the case of Florida, the very areas that I mentioned just now were hit by both. Helene less so, as in that case, it was mostly the surge that went inland into Tampa Bay and elsewhere. It's Milton that has brought serious problems to western Florida. Many areas that were spared from the worst of Ian, like Sarasota and places elsewhere, were hit directly by the storm. And at the time of recording, it made landfall this week. It's not looking good, and on top of the historic tornado outbreak that occurred, where multiple intense tornadoes struck the state, including one that hit Fort Myers, there's a lot of unknowns right now, and with surge being reported to parts of Lee and Charlotte counties, while they weren't hit the worst this time, many questions are arising about how the community could begin to recover once more. I think it goes without saying that both storms alongside Beryl are getting covered at some point in the future, but at this time, I'm unsure how well the last part of this script has aged. Yeah, so college has kind of been kicking my butt lately, and I haven't really had the time to really work on this as much as I wanted to. And when I wanted to, life decided to be an inconvenience, but you know what? I don't have the time to talk about it here. So, special thanks to my proofreaders, those being Elliot and Ian Height, Subsequent for the character stills I use, Zinno, Cyanide Blue, and Krakalek for letting me use their music whenever I use it, Xavier for the hurricane icons and animations, Black Belt for no-lifing the track animation, Southwest Florida Elevators for agreeing to an interview, Colton Henderson for letting me use his footage, and everyone for watching. It means a lot. I nearly forgot, Peter Corman, who let me use his radar loop. I almost forgot about that. Oops. Special thanks to those subscribed to the channel Patreon or are a YouTube member. Those being Ace Cooper, Montpelier, and Will M at the Ulfies Army tier, Helldrake Zero, Tanner, Techno Idioto, I hope I pronounced that right, and Warm Off the String at the Elf Junior tier, and Autostradamus, Brian Hawley, Bipolar Batty, Dante DMC, Fat Tub of MSG, Foscrew, Foxtrot, Hannah Stormer, Josh Shoemaker, Justice Crater, Kara Kelly, K-Tay, King Shisha, Liz Swaff, Means Beans Machines, Mama G, Nido-kun, Neon Binary, Rama, Sarastro is Bad at Gaming, Southwest Florida Elevators, Tefu, The Avalanche, and Van Granny at the Ulf Mini tier, and everyone listed at the Ulf Supporter tier. Also, for those who have canceled their memberships and their names on here, that's just because I'm including supporters who began supporting in September, so just so you know. If you want to have access to full uncut interviews and my scripts, alongside other things in the future, consider subscribing to the Patreon or becoming a YouTube member at the Ulf Mini tier. It helps me financially and will allow me to do in-person interviews in the future. Anyways, that covers everything. If you enjoy what I do, consider liking, subscribing to the channel, commenting your thoughts, and sharing it around. If you want to see more of me, which I don't know why, but if you do, you can follow me on Blue Sky and Twitter, and even join my Discord server that is in the description. I'm Alferia, you all stay safe, and I'll see you all soon.